And now we want to let's say, foster this dialogue between the global level and the local level. How can they closer work together?
There are a number of countries which can successfully mitigate drought impacts.
The Amazon, I think it's like 20% have already been lost, and it's not clear how much more this large ecosystem can tolerate.
The agenda has moved from a discussion around aid for drought-affected people towards first getting that better plan, but then now moving into a proactive and resilience-building agenda.
This evening is part of a longer way that several of us have gone together for the last 4 years. It has its origin in a project funded by the SEVO initiative of the German Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development, BMZ, on a potpourri of topics, and one of them was drought resilience. And I was maybe one word for the origin of this project. I was involved in the drought of 2011, I think it was, and I was working for BMZ on developing strategies for long-term drought resilience. And in this last drought, it was almost the last drought, cost more than 100,000 deaths in the area, mainly Somalian people who didn't make it to the border at that time, to the Kenyan border. So it was, at that time, I really was, many of us were emotionally very shaken by this event. And when I had the opportunity now with the SEVO program to come back to the topic and work more closely on it, I took the opportunity. And I found very like-minded persons during the time, and the first one was here Daniel Zegai from now UNCCD. At that time he was still at ZEF, I think. Oh no, UN Water. And shortly after he became the drought responsible person in UNCCD. And we started to conduct studies in Ethiopia and Kenya, together with an Ethiopian consultant, Mesai Dulguma, who today is not with us. She has gone back to Ethiopia. And we presented these findings widely, and we organized a large conference series here in Bonn with many different actors, including the university, for example. Mr. Millerman was there, I think, actively involved, DIE, GIZ, ZEF, or the United Nations organization were involved. And we had then also the opportunity to edit a book later to that, together with 2 other researchers, Evaristo Mapezza from the International Water Management Institute, and Robert McLeeman from Wilfrid Laurier University. And some condensed summary of that book will also be presented this evening. We also produced a film which visualizes 2 components, or the most important components of drought risk management, which is active resilience support and reactive emergency support in the case of major drought events. And that was done by Patrick Augenstein, who is the filmmaker there. He will also be on the panel later. So you see, we have all gathered here. And what we present you to this evening is a collection of products and thoughts around the topic of drought. Topic is very present nowadays in Germany because we had 2 super dry summers, which may have even changed a part of our vegetation, of our landscape. And also, of course, the fires in Australia, which remind us every day of deep impact of drought. The droughts are most certainly also the effect of climate change, but what I also always find important to mention is that drought challenge is older than climate change. I just want to remind one interesting thing is that it is reported that in 1540 you could cross the river Rhine by foot because there was a very large drought. Of course, today we in Germany, we are no longer threatened in our very existence by drought, but in poor rural areas of many developing countries, this is still the case. And as much as drought are a severe threat to these people, and also as much as drought will become more intensive, frequent, and threatening through climate change, the most important message that we want to convey this evening is that much can be done to reduce the impacts of drought if a government is willing to invest and to strengthen governance around drought topics and drought preparedness. The best resilience is the one that people develop by themselves through more stable, diversified incomes, more resilient agro-ecosystems, food markets, insurance, savings and credit, and other measures. And the second best option, but often unavoidable, if nature strikes too hard, is a well-prepared government that enables its local communities to deliver support in a way that does not hamper, but support rehabilitation and future drought resilience. We want to go forward with these with works, and this evening is part of that journey. The UNCCD has received during the COP14 in September 2018 a refreshed mandate to go into drought work, and an ambition that has even paved the creation of the UNCCD. Then the UNFCCC, the Climate Convention, the big brother in the 3 Rio Conventions, also deals with drought as part of climate change adaptation. And these 2 global initiatives are working here in Bonn, so we are very happy that they come together. And since we have seen in this all our work that the best way to build resilience is starting from the bottom up, we are also very happy to have achieved to have a representative of ICLEI, the global network of local governments for sustainability, on board today. And now we want to let's say, foster this dialogue between the global level and the local level. How can they closer work together and design initiatives which are really, first of all, improving the resilience bottom up before we go to these emergency solutions. So this we will discuss in the second half of the evening, together with Imme Scholz from DIE, who is the managing director, and she is very experienced especially in natural resource management, so that is a very important part of drought resilience management. Patrick Augenstein will join us, and the panelists will be further introduced by Gabrielle Anne-Lipton from C4, I think, no? C4, and now with the Global Landscape Forum. And we are very thankful for you to help us and assist us in our event. And before we start with the panel in the second half, we want first to screen the film, a shortened version of the film, I think 25 minutes around, which gives us a visual and emotional introduction to the topic, and also already some topics which local people can do to improve their resilience. And the second, for 10 minutes, Daniel Zegal will give a brief presentation of the main messages of the book. And after that, the panel will start.
We still have biblical famines in the 21st century. Every 5 seconds, a child of less than 10 years of age dies as a consequence of malnutrition on a planet with unprecedented wealth and surpluses. It is the inconceivable shame of our time. The human right to food does not seem to exist. How can you live in dignity when you are dying of hunger?
ንሳ ሞይታ ትህፃን ግን ህይወት ነይርዎ ላጠወ ብጣዕሚ ክትልዕሎ ሃሞ ክትገብር እውን የፀግመልካ ነይሩ ከፍቲ እውን
ካዚ ግን ሃሊቁ እዩ ላ ተሸጠ ላ ተበልዐ ምሕደር እንትፋስ ላ ተገበረ በቃ ሃምታድር ካብ ቤተክርስቲያን እንደረኹም ጓ ሃማያ ነይራ ክሻዕዛ ገዛዝያ
In this film, we will follow 2 individuals in the East African country of Ethiopia. The first, a strong-willed woman from a village in the Tigray region, representative of many thousands of other villages. At the end of the 20th century, this region has been hit by a famine unlike any other area on the African continent. But what are people doing today, proactively and on the ground, to better cope with the impacts of a lasting drought and the political systems too often failing to deliver relief?
The United Nations has been told the famine across 4 countries is now the biggest crisis for the organisation since it was founded.
We stand at a critical point in our history.
And we have to be 100% sure that we dispatch this food as well as the South Sudanese operation.
The second person is a man who has dedicated his life to dispatch food to those left with nothing, to those on the brink of starvation, relying on the international community to prevent the unimaginable.
I will go personally to the warehouses and check if these foods are moving, and we will see. So I'll get back to you. This is November Foxtrot 1B copy.
What insights can we gain from both of their worlds? And would there be a way to proactively link grassroots initiatives, political frameworks, and emergency relief to bring an end to famine?
We just had a verification assessment of people affected by the conflict. And I'm going to brief you on the major findings of this. Is the boundary. This is the Somali region. There has always been conflict at the border area because of different reasons: pasture, water, clan conflict. But the nature of this one is unprecedented, as explained by the community. As a result, now we have people displaced, properties damaged, and there is still tension. The country's defense force is deployed. The number of displaced people over 300,000, but the entire region, it is 578,000, so more than 500,000. We are talking about pastoral areas that suffered already 3 consecutive years of below average rain performance. It's going to be extremely overstretched. So this needs urgent attention and urgent response. So just to show some pictures, and this is where they want to sleep on. People were emotional when they saw this. It was really, the situation was so sad. What do you think this is?
It seems porridge.
It's actually water. It's water from the pond. So they showed us this is the water they are drinking. So these purification chemicals provided by UNICEF are urgently needed. Food support must go to these people urgently. It will be life-saving. If it doesn't go urgently, it won't help. There is no proper sanitation facility. An outbreak of disease is evident. All medical facilities are now out of any emergency drug supply. It is urgently needed.
What do you think will happen within a short period if the response does not arrive? Have we already started, or we are still talking? Because now there is no need of talking, it's time to act. You made assessment, but sometimes even the assessment by itself, it needs not to be put as a priority number 1. If still we are waiting time and we are still talking, what will happen to these people? How many children will die there?
When we asked the government for initial briefing, they said to us, we need food in the vehicle you are using for the assessment. We give you the number of people affected. That's all you need now. Get food assistance to these people. If not, we will soon see ugly pictures.
Maybe because I'm a mother, and I know, always women feel more than the men.
Yes,
when you talk about protection, I was also seeing that there was sexual abuse.
We have seen children without parents. Like the wife is here, the husband is not there. Yeah. The husband is here, the wife is not there. 2 of the children are here, 3 children left, and stuff like that. So, yes, there are huge protection issues out there.
So what is expected from us to do?
We have to take extraordinary action on this one, because these IDPs don't have any other means of survival. They entirely depend on this food. So There is so much expected from our office on this one.
So you can count on us.
Thank you.
حدرها هاي سرح لغي عصد له نادى حدرها صبغ العصيد صبغينها قنجعيو قنجا صبغ قوعيو صبغ قوعيو ودي العصد خانيرها خو خالي
زيا شمول ماليا زيا با شمول ماليا زيا شقوطيا زيا غريا
يخوني
زيا تايما ديا
زيا شمول ماليا
هو زيا خما زيا لكو لملم خوينا بحفتايا
زيا لمليا زيا
هو
زيا ماتو تايدي البهال سمو دهاني
شقوطي غوجديا
وجوغو
وزيا شحانيا
زيا ما شحان
هو خزي زيا حريغون خالي حمام يخون زيا تصاوريتيا
زيا
هو زيا اي تصاورينا خرمتين
ما يتوحد تلو زيا يا
هو ما يتوحد
تطورنا مالتي
هو زيا ما يتوحد زيا تطورنا
مهرتل تعتخ زيا دتخن
هو سايا
زيا تا مهرتل
سانا مهرتيا
هو هادي مسلكا انه لما زي تحوسنا ين هنا لوين يفليو حميقو حر خوينو
هو
تسقم حر خوين تو حميقو تسنداي وصل
سنداي وصل
حدي يقنططل
كاو صبغ يعتلنا صبغ مهرتي صبغ خستايات
حدي قلتي شكتنا تزرينا يا جن يبللنا
Yes, Mike, good morning.
Fred, listen, I just got a call from South Sudan. There's an area they've been trying to airdrop into for the last 2 weeks. A lot of displaced people there. They've been unable to get approval from the authorities. They just got it, but the window is short. They've got to drop tomorrow afternoon latest.
We have TSF food, urgently to be dispatched to the IDP areas in Borno, Guji and Bali. And this is very, very critical. Can we do both jobs?
Fred, our team here, of course we can handle it. The TSF is already under loading, but we've got to get instructions now to load urgently for the airport. 2 to 3 trucks for South Sudan airdrops. The window's tomorrow. It's got to go or we lose it. It's only got a 4-hour window.
I have the commissioner from Oromia DRMC calling me every 2-3 hours to make sure that this food is dispatched. And we have to be 100% sure that we dispatch this food as well as the South Sudanese operation.
They are coming out of different warehouses. We'll get them there.
Okay, Mike. So I will take this. I will take personally. I will take this very seriously. I will go personally to the warehouses and check if both these foods are moving, and we will see. So I'll get back to you.
Okay, right, I'll go on it. I'll start calling the warehouse managers, get this moving.
We need to go to the warehouse very urgently. Please come.
Okay. A matter of urgency, the UN declares that parts of South Sudan are experiencing famine and warns that by July, half of the population will be without a reliable source of food.
Over the last 150 years, agricultural intensification, worldwide trade, economic growth and social security nets have made people less dependent on local harvests, thereby reducing the impacts of drought. However, every year we still hear alarming news about hundreds of thousands or even millions of people threatened by famines. Human conflicts, war and corrupt political systems, in combination with droughts, are the primary reason for large-scale famines today. Thus, much more than food has to be delivered to prevent droughts from becoming impediments for development.
وزتخلي زي مع زديته تخيلوا
حملة
أو حملة ماي مستايخة مع جميرو مكس خاص قال
ما جميرنا ينابز خزيو ما مسقارص إننا جميرنا
لمتاي خيتكم
لنفاسي هيوتيو ماي تقاميو تليو ما ينلو نفاس اللط عنا له
ما تصبغ دا يقبل اللط بتاخي
صبغ يو حافظنا عون بتعمي المشفانس بتعمي دسلالنا
يا أمر اللي تاي نوعلو إمنتي نوعلو تغني بعلو حلي لقيت منقستي لورد اللمبة أغلى لا يورس وي تقبلنا في لول يخونه حلا وكون لول اللي يتمنقست جر لنا مالك
يتقمنا بتعمي تقامي
معنى يدقق أو حوس ولا مساعتهم تعرفته تمرخ قالي عتن تقنيا لا تتخيل العلب بالها كأوزن تعرفهم خفتهم أرارمهم أنا لوزي تخلّه إلى بنك أشي كم تصمي كأوسخها ما جرخا أرارم خا تجزا هاي أرارم خاتم لوهاز خن زودة هذا مجمرتا لزقلنا مدحانيت يكون لنا يم حاصر جنزب كيبلعلنا حاصر يناينا تخلنا يا بلاي ماي لصدق دخناي خازي اخليس يقول لنا جنزب كيبلعو خالي لا ندادي يكون لنا وجل يسرحنا جزا ما كاولا قدتنا نسرحينا جزان سرح لبو
This is November Foxtrot 1 and we are reporting movement from the office to the warehouse.
من يسرحوا
بعلي
نزي كاخ مزي شنبابو
كاف داجر قسم تنايو
تهر تصرحوا
هو
تأخلق مع زيو تعزيدو
حدار
ايش هذا اول
وديك أسيلا
لقرات اللي حربت القرا خا حصعنا هو يتكم لو كل المشاريع المشلا يتكم
سنداي لطافيكا يتكم
اي لو حانش خلو العطاف لو يبلع
خازو خعيتكم ديكم توصوا
هو
بنتها توصوا يهم
بقرات غير يلو غزون بارغ لا غورهم
بارغ لا غورهم
برخة بعرقيو
تاي ساعات كتوصوا
ما بالواقع يلنس ناس كأو كحرس روح سيو زي هذه كاي ري كاي زي هذيس بقى ناوط كشع تحساس ترينا
ورقني أكب
أي ناوط ري
ما زي المشراي ورقي
رايا
باي بقى دنبني أيوه
لفظ يودي
واي صباق من السلاس النسائية صبق كومبوس باني أكم
Back to the office, over. Thank you, out. تذكر تكون أنت إيش؟
Do you have some lines about press release?
Sure. According to the latest humanitarian requirement document, there are still 8.5 million people in need of emergency relief assistance. And we as WFP are supporting 3.3 million out of this. But the country is still on track in achieving the intended goal of ending hunger in 2030. We continue to engage with the government, work in partnership with the country to achieve these goals.
أنا هالشيء حاضر غيت لنا من في زيانتنا تحجنا أو يا أمس خذ هذا دفترك تحزيه
اللي كنت قلت لي أنا مرة
سكر ولا هذا عشان كنت يا هون عخون قلنا هنرد لنا دما نخما خزالة خمسة لي ولا فكرنا عن خريج همي كم زعكر كم تاول صار تعال نزي أطنبق إلى قالي تعال زي أطنبق إلى تيا فتاويته قاخي وقاخ هندي بل وقاخ هندي باي فين كدي مسعي سرا جزي أيه
November bed, this is November Foxtrot 1, do you copy?
Copy November Foxtrot 1.
November Foxtrot 1 is departing for warehouse and we will report from there. Stand by, please.
Standing by, over.
Please stand by until we report departure of the last trucks from our warehouse. Please stand by. until we report that. Is message copied? Over. አንደኛ መኪናስ ሰላም ነው? አንደኛ መኪና ይችላል ገርባው ያኛው ጫነ
For millions, the United Nations World Food Programme often is the very last lifeline, an organisation that struggles with ever-decreasing funds, while the total number of those in desperate need of food keeps rising again. We found ways to orbit this planet, to walk on the moon, and yet we seem to be tangled up in debates of what causes a famine. For decades, demographers would blame overpopulation, overlooking the fact that no famine has ever slowed down or stopped population growth in any of the affected countries in the long run. Mass mortality as Darwin's balancing check on mankind is as much cynical as it is an illusion. For far too long, famines had been brought into monocausal relationship with rain, defining it as a pure natural phenomenon, making it a God-given plague. In the Anthropocene, where we humans have altered the planet's climate significantly, be it through local deforestation or the global burning of fossil fuels, such definition falls short of any explanatory power, trying to naturalize something that is deeply political. A governance analyst would identify the root causes in political power struggles over resource access, genocidal politics, in some instances the deliberate withholding of food by the international community, as well as disastrous experiments in social engineering. That the severest famines in the 20th century occurred in authoritarian states is a point in time. Mao's China, Stalin's Russia, Pol Pot's Cambodia, Mengistu's Ethiopia. That virtually every country experiencing a famine in the past 20 years has suffered from conflict, another indicator. Economists would add, it is because of the imperfect markets that purchasing power is missing, the means for production not available, or the integration into global food markets not yet achieved. Those more critical of the prevailing economic systems might add further, there is no legal or moral basis for expecting unregulated markets to meet subsistence needs. Although our understanding of famine is incomplete, and each famine is driven by a case-specific set of circumstances, famines happen because we allow them to happen. Contemporary famines are socio-political processes much more than anything triggered by the prolonged absence of precipitation or by population increase. Purely drought-induced famines seem to have receded into history, being superseded by political famines, pointing towards a crisis of our own human consciousness and structures. Early warning systems monitoring our planet in real time since decades are no more than space debris if the information is not translated into political action on Earth. Too often, there is a fatal delay between early warnings and timely response, rendering all sophisticated technological advances to monuments of irrelevance. The last century has seen the highest number of people dying from starvation, with more than 70 million deaths. This is not only the highest number in all of human history, but it also occurred at the precise historical moment when the technical capacity to abolish famine was first achieved. This may be humanity's greatest indictment. To see an end to famine, we need greater political accountability and a transformation in our consciousness that will be visible in our institutions and on the land. We need to substantially invest in the recovery of ecological systems, healing the scars of landscapes that still bear the legacies of the past, actively restoring soil fertility, rebuilding hydrological cycles, researching improved crop varieties, expanding sustainable irrigation agriculture, investing in proper storage facilities that reduced post-harvest losses to zero. We need to provide access to microcredit and insurance schemes for times of crop failure and establish a banking system that serves society and not the other way around. Along with improved interlinkages between short-term emergency relief, these measures will enhance the resilience of any given household. On a political level, national drought policies need to be formulated that proactively enhance these measures. And a first anti-famine accord needs to be established at a global scale. The international community must demonstrate, without delay, the political will to unconditionally prevent the preventable.
بدحريو دماناي ساعة شوعتي تاي تقعد تاي درك نيرو
ولا يفتات اللي مثل دركتات سدركتات ون سلالله أوز خز جزية جن منم لتدرك أسي كتك عكاي خلي منجست ون بزح دقفات يقبر اللي خلي يترف اخلي صحي ذي كم موتي ترفه شكوار تيترفه ولا أغلى التوحيد كوا أفتش عايز تجدي كل شكوار ستيخال تعلى اللون يا نوري خذ ده أبو الناس ستيخا شكوار ستيخال على اللي أيو ما يتدم ما يسلا لزعه ما يقول ستيخال على اللي اللي من قستوني التحاور اللي أيو تناش عايز تجدي ده دفي كار حل من التحاور نيرجيو.
I wish to see a world where you don't have people suffering from lack of food, which is a right, which something everybody is entitled because they are human beings. So I wish to see a world without hunger, because it can happen, it can be done.
requires applause almost. Very nice pictures for a very serious topic. We will directly continue.
I'm very much pleased to be here to launch on behalf of the co-editors, who happens to be Michael Bruntrup, one of the co-editors, and many of the authors are also here in this room, a book on drought challenge policy options for developing countries. This is an edited volume with about 22 chapters, and I think it comes right in time in terms of what to do in terms of the policy options, especially that the momentum is now there in terms of what to do on drought preparedness with developing countries, especially. As you have already seen it in the film, drought, we cannot stop drought, but we can always stop drought from becoming a famine. So the challenge is there, but there are policy options. Technically and in terms of innovation, the technology is already there. So there are some complications around the options of policy in terms of drought. That's what we try to also capture in this book. So this edited volume captures, first tries to enhance understanding of the current exposure, sensitivity and adaptive capacity of drought. The focus is on developing countries, except one or two chapters on developing. Many of them are on developing. And it also identifies a range of political adaptation options versus the adaptations that are actually taking place. There are a number of countries which can successfully mitigate drought impacts, but there are also options which you can also not compare with. So there are, we need to also compare a range of potential adaptation options, and we recognize also the challenges that exist, the barriers, in terms of implementing the various adaptation options that are currently not being utilized. What can we do more? And it identifies emergent and potential future drought risks, as well as what are the opportunities, because in every challenge there is an opportunity. Okay, so the key topics covered in this volume are determinants of droughts, impacts, and adaptation. We try to see a number of case studies where we see a wide range of drought impacts, especially case studies from Africa, Asia, and Latin America, and the Caribbean. The need for an integrated approach. The biggest problem, as we can already see also in the challenge section, is there is a silo approach. So how can we go about integrated approach to capacity building and drought management? And the emphasis should also be on gender dimensions of drought and impacts and adaptation, because the vulnerable groups are in many cases women and children. And it highlights also the need to incorporate indigenous knowledge. There is some indigenous knowledge that has to be appreciated, that has to be communicated in a more formal way to help also mitigate drought impacts. And early warning and monitoring systems is also one of the key topics in the book, and mechanisms for building resilience. In the early warning, we talk about early warning and early action. I think you have seen it already in the film. Early warning does not necessarily mean that it's early action. Unless it becomes an action, early warning in itself as an information is not going to be useful. And it's also stressed the need to adapt monitoring and early warning systems to local contexts, because the local context should also be appreciated. I think in the panel discussion, we are also going to see how we can get the feedback from the marginal communities, the local capacities, and how can we translate it into a proper mitigation mechanism. And it highlights also the potential of new technologies. There are a number of innovations in remote sensing, especially. There are a few chapters on early warning systems. And it brings also to light the fact that preparedness is trapped in policy and decision-making silos. The silos should also be broken. And mechanisms for building drought resilience, we have a number of case studies that I'm not going to highlight in here at least. So as I say, there are 22 chapters. And it's second chapter on drought, migration, and conflict. Especially in the case of sub-Saharan Africa, we can always try to integrate the early warning on drought with early warning on conflict, because droughts are most harmful and damaging in conflict zones. So the early warning in marginal communities, like what Michael Bruntrup was saying about Somalia, 500,000 or 400,000 people died not only because of drought, but because of the conflict and security issues. And lessons from El Nino, the drought in Southern Africa region in 2015, 2016, drought preparedness and livelihood impacts also on Northeast Brazil, where we have a very good case study of cisterns that were, I think the government was trying to mobilize funds for establishing cisterns that can do a good water harvesting, and this is a very good case for many Latin America and the Caribbean countries, and it's a good model for the countries in the region. And also another chapter in Mexico, perspectives on tradition, change, and adaptation. And we also have another chapter on rural Colombia and the shifting limits in terms of drought adaptation in rural Colombia. And from Southern Africa and the development community regions from Southern Africa region, also on gender livelihood implications, trying to see what women are the victims, the prime victims of drought, but they are also the source for innovation, the source for solution. Integrating regional climate and drought preparedness also in India, and a few other chapters also on especially early warning and monitoring systems, the potential for satellite remote sensing and beyond, development of a system, drought monitoring and assessment in South Asia. I tried to somehow also shorten the titles, so they are not the exact titles. Early warning for drought and violent conflict is also a very interesting chapter, in chapter 11, trying to see also overlay of maps on conflict zones and drought affected regions in terms of the impacts. You see a clear indication where the impacts of droughts are severe in terms of their affecting the livelihood when they are overlaid with conflict zones. So security is an issue. Weather index insurance is also one of the innovative options to mitigate drought impacts, and we have a few chapters on that, on drought insurance and SLM. How can we try to give an incentive for farmers, for example, to come up with an option of insurance. So integrating agricultural insurance schemes with sustainable land management. If you rehabilitate your land, you can have a reduced premium. And there was some kind of literature review on that. And then an assessment of early warning and drought monitoring in Tanzania, drought-tolerant crops in Uganda, and social protection schemes, a very successful productive safety net program in Ethiopia, and how it implies also for reducing drought resilience is another chapter. Drought and livestock management strategies by pastoralists in Kenya, and trying to also build resilience to droughts for small-scale farmers in Eastern African drylands. We have a number of good cases also from Kenya. And chapter 20, policy coherence for drought resilient food security. I think this was also being mentioned by Michael from Ethiopia and Kenya, a good case on how drought preparedness and policies can also enhance drought preparedness. And another one from the US, and then the final one is just lessons learned. So I'm not going to take much of your time. I have only 2 slides. One is what are the key lessons learned? The challenge, ad hoc reactive measures are still the norm, the main government approach. We keep trying to discuss about drought as a crisis, so we need to keep it as a risk. So there are some improvements, there are some developments. It has started to change. With the UNCCD, we have a drought initiative where about 72 countries are now developing or even enhancing their national drought policies based on the principles of risk reduction. If you go to each country, they claim to have a national drought policy, but what they have is what to do when drought strikes. This is not a policy, this is just an emergency plan. So we are trying to make a shift in the paradigm where the attitude of drought should change from crisis to risk. We need to have a preparedness plan. So about 72 countries are now working on this, and many more countries are now emerging. And lack of coherent and comprehensive drought management policy in many developing countries. In some countries, the question is about financial resources. In some, it is a structural issue. The responsibilities are diverse. They keep talking about drought in almost every ministry and sector, but no one is taking charge of even declaring drought. It becomes political because they are going to be responsible. And then it becomes too late. So there are some structural issues also. Data on drought hazards, what you cannot measure, you cannot manage. So data is a very critical issue, especially in developing countries. And data on gender dimensions of drought vulnerability. When the impacts of drought are assessed in many countries, they don't disaggregate it according to gender. But if 100,000 people are affected, majority, maybe 80 or 85,000 are women and children. So you need to disaggregate this so that you see who is affected. And that is also lacking that we have seen. So the take-home message, I think I'm missing one. Okay, then there are some. slides, but at least the take-home message is we need to continue to learn from continuous improvement, which is needed on science, policy, and practices to reduce drought risks in the world. We need to be dynamic. We cannot just keep saying that this is the case. So without it, droughts will continue to undermine our livelihoods, erode people's trust in situations, in institutions, and it will also reduce our collective chance of meeting the SDGs and beyond. Thank you. It's still not an free, like an Elsevier book publication, so we are still trying to negotiate for an open license, but at least the introduction chapter and the final chapter are going to be open online for free.
Thank you all so much for joining us tonight. I think we're going to have a great panel discussion. We have some really diverse and interesting experts with us. So we can start with Patrick. We saw his film earlier, which really did a great job showing what Daniel and Michael have so brilliantly discussed in their book about how can you hear me okay? Yeah. Okay, good. About how drought is often perceived as an emergency and what we can really do at the local level.
Yeah, it's the interference.
Is it here? Is it
maybe the
down
mobile
there?
phone? Is it your mobile phone?
Oh, we can move that. It's not a problem.
Maybe, yeah.
Thanks. Anyways, yes, so getting to what we can do at the local level so that it doesn't have to be an emergency and communities are ready to handle it and there are measures in place to deal with it effectively. And then, so Patrick is a filmmaker. He's made films about ecosystems all around the world. And he has a PhD in ecosystem restoration from the University of Bremen. We also have with us Louise Baker. She is she's the coordinator of external relations and the policy unit of the UNCCD for about 9 years now, and she was previously with the World Health Organization on political advocacy campaigns and spent some time with the European Parliament as well. So a really interesting background with us. We have Chad Tudenggongbu. I hope I said that okay. Joining us from. Was that correct?
That's correct.
Okay, great. From UNFCCC. He's an associate program officer and has a background in renewable energy and spent a bit of time at ICLEI in the US as well, I think. That's right. So that's great. We have a bit of overlap with Maryke van Staden. She's the director of the Bonn Center for Local Climate Action and Reporting, and also has a really interesting background in sustainable energy and energy security, as well as integrating national and subnational climate action efforts and local community action. So she'll be great to tell us more about how we can bridge the gaps between the local and the international levels. And we have as well Imme Scholz. Thank you for hosting us here at DIE tonight. She's the acting director of this institution that we're in. She has a background in sociology and spent more than 20 years working in sustainable development, everything from consumption habits to land use and policy, and spent time in the Amazon as well. So you can see we have a really interesting panel with us tonight. So we'll start kind of at the very beginning. I'd like to direct this at you, Louise. And this is taking it back to how we perceive drought. So when UNCCD was being negotiated about half a century ago, 25 years, drought wasn't then perceived as a global phenomenon. How have you seen this narrative around drought change since then? And what do you think, which parts of awareness about how we perceive drought still need to be developed?
Gosh, okay. Big question. I wasn't around at the beginning of the negotiations, thank goodness. But I think, honestly, when they negotiated the convention, UNCCD and the issue of drought was very much seen as an African problem. It was poor people deal with that sort of issue. And I think the realization is that, yes, poor people are the people who are going to be most affected by it, but it's an issue that affects everybody in every ecosystem. It affects everybody in every part of the world. We're on a sort of maybe a continuum of suffering in terms of what drought impacts, but it is the same processes everywhere, and that we need to adopt. So again, I suppose it's moved. The agenda has moved from a discussion around aid for drought-affected people towards first getting that better plan, but then now moving into a proactive and resilience-building agenda that says that, okay, we need to be ready to react if there is going to be a drought, but we need to minimize and mitigate as much as we can at every level in all parts of the world. And I think what you've seen is that there's also been a willingness to share more. So you've seen expertise being developed in certain parts of the world that was for the longest time kept in that part of the world. And now we're beginning to see a narrative where the common understanding of everybody's going to be affected by this means that there's a willingness to share more of the resources intellectually and hopefully in terms of investment going forward.
That's great. And I think the book is a great example of sharing things intellectually. It's so broad and encompasses so much. So bringing drought into a very current perspective, I would like to turn to you, Imme. The past 12 months, we've seen some of the most devastating wildfires from the Amazon, where you've spent a portion of your career, and now, of course, in Australia. What do these fires tell us about the linkages between drought and climate change globally, and what should we be learning from these disasters?
Thank you. I think it is important to know, to be clear about the differences between the fires in Australia and in the Amazon region. So in Australia, we have seen that the fires have broken out very early in the dry season. We have drought-resistant ecosystems in those regions, and we have wildfires in the real sense of the word. So it's not been arson. Arson has not been the main cause. I mean, the press has talked a lot about arson being the cause, but it's clear from the data that arson is a very low percentage for the fires. And what has been so shocking has been the early start of the fires, the uncontrollability of these fires, and the huge amount of destruction. I mean, if you look at the area, if you look at the affected animals, nearly half of the population of koalas has burned. So the effects have been large in terms of destruction, so what you can measure economically, but I mean, I think the loss in biodiversity cannot be measured, cannot be measured in that sense. Now in the Amazon, the fires are not wildfires, they have been laid. And the Amazon is a very humid region, and the effects of, so the reasons for these fires being so widespread are because the political message of the government, of the federal government of Bolsonaro has been, the Amazon is there to be exploited and the forest is in the way of economic exploitation. So it's nothing to do with drought or with natural causes. It's a reaction of people who see massive benefits in getting rid of the forest. Now, why it is so alarming and why it is called a disaster is because much of the Amazon, I think it's like 20%, have already been lost, and it's not clear how much more this large ecosystem can tolerate before it breaks down, because before savannization takes place, and we know that much of the precipitation in the core agricultural areas of Brazil depend on the precipitation cycles, the rain which is being generated in the Amazon. Yeah, so thank you. So that is one of the regional impacts disappearance of the forest would have, and it will also, of course, generate massive CO2 emissions in the short term. So enhance global warming from that perspective. So very different ecosystems, very different reasons behind the fires, and different impacts. And what we know about drought in the Amazon has been occurring more, although it is very rare, and it is expected that it will happen more often, depending on stronger El Nino phenomena, and that also has effects then on beyond the Amazon region on global level.
Mm-hmm. And I think the fires in the Amazon have really alerted how much global action is needed, especially when the national action isn't quite being taken.
Well, that is a different discussion, and it's a separate discussion, how much you can actually influence and through which levers you can influence stopping fires in the Amazon. That is a complex discussion.
For sure. Patrick, going to you and your films, communication around drought and about any climate change issue is so important. And so could you tell us a bit about how you try to form a narrative and communicate drought in a way that can help activate and connect actors at different levels?
Thank you very much for the interesting question, which is also complex. Maybe one could answer it in two directions. One is format and the other one is content. I think in terms of format, what proved workable in the past is to have different outputs. To have like short outputs, maybe 7-minute outputs, targeting at policymakers, where you really condense the message. And the other one, like a documentary format, where you're aiming at 25 or 35 minutes, trying to reach greater audiences. And maybe then unconventional, very short ones of like a couple of seconds for the short attention span of specific audience in the World Wide Web. So I think that in terms of format is useful. On the content side, I think what we always try to do in the past is to understand the science behind it and then find a narrative and whatever is representative for the science of whatever given topic there is. So in this specific case, drought. So the entry point should always be the scientific validity and then trying to build the narrative around this, which is a little bit counterintuitive, I would say, to how usually journalism is working. But I think that was our strategy in the past and also for this film here, that we tried to do.
Yeah, I think it is working well. So moving into the different levels of governance, Maryke, could you share with us a little bit about the roles and responsibilities of, excuse me, local and regional governments? How can they serve as really valuable links between local communities and national and international levels? And also, what challenges do they potentially face as being blocks in that chain?
Sure, thank you very much. Well, actually, Patrick, policymakers have a 7-minute attention span. Maybe that's actually an interesting aspect to look into.
Time budget available in between meetings.
I think in an ideal world, and we are not in an ideal world, but in a democratic space, every level of government, from local to national, should know what its roles and responsibilities are in times of crisis, but actually preferably before times of crisis. And I think this is the big challenge that we need. We've heard about the early warning, the timely response. This is a governmental issue, and it is all about good governance. And I think that's an aspect where we are failing, maybe in quite a big scale, and we need to better understand how to enhance good governance, where every single level of government needs to understand its particular role, its particular responsibilities, and how it interacts with other levels of government, and take on that responsibility. I think that is, for me, especially when we're talking about climate change, we're seeing a lovely upsurge of subnational governments really wanting to tackle climate change and be prepared. So one of the roles of a local government, for example, could be to develop a climate risk and vulnerability assessment, to also understand the levels of threat, the potential of a risk or a vulnerability to surface or resurface, how regularly are they anticipating it, also looking at the history, speaking to their community stakeholders, speaking to indigenous people. They are the voice of the community in a way, and I think that's the level of government that really can speak to the community and the different community groups and feed back to other levels of government what the problems are or the potential problems, and help design a robust, resilient plan where from the local government and the regional government, one would need to bring in a team of multidisciplinary experts, from the mayor's office to your engineering teams, to your sectoral teams, not just the water guys, but also the energy guys, and think holistically. And I think that needs breaking through the silos is an important thing, which the mayor's office or the governor's office can actually facilitate. I think in terms of normal urban planning plans is something that also we can connect these better to climate action plans and connect these better to sustainable development plans. If we have one integrated, coherent plan that deals with different aspects, I think one can also anticipate better where the problems and challenges might start and then deal with them much more effectively.
Chad, could you tell us a little bit about UNFCCC's efforts going back down to the local level? UNFCCC has really honed in on supporting local community networks. Could you talk about what you've learned, or what UNFCCC has learned from this? What strengths are of local community networks, as well as their needs, and what they can really offer resilience?
Sure thing. So first of all, thank you everyone for coming, and thank you for having us as part of this conversation. Responding to your question regarding local communities and what their responses are and what we've learned from it. In 2015, Paris, it's established a platform called the Local Communities and Indigenous Peoples Platform that is recognizing the importance of indigenous peoples, their knowledge, their value systems, and also local communities. And so since then, there has been tremendous progress on developing that platform. COP23 in Bonn, it's decided the functions of the platform, which are to facilitate exchange of knowledge. I think part of the, as the speaker mentioned in the book, the transformation, the integrated approach. So 3 functions. The first function is to facilitate exchange of knowledge, to bring in knowledge of indigenous peoples, to bring in local knowledges, but also to bring in scientific, or what may be called as Western science. Secondly, to build capacity. So it's not that you bring different entities together and that they would automatically know how to work together. So build capacity, and it's not building just the capacity of local communities and indigenous people, say how they can engage in the international process, but also to work with the government, to build the capacity of parties and the other stakeholders who may want to work with local communities and indigenous peoples. How can they do that? And then finally is really to bring the diverse knowledge systems together into climate policies and actions so that they are coherent. And COP24 in Poland further developed the platform, and it's established a facilitated working group. So under the UNFCCC, there are different constituted bodies, and so this is one of the newest. And what's unique about this one is the membership composition of this constituted body is unprecedented in the sense it's 14 members, and 7 members are representatives of indigenous peoples from the 7 socio-cultural regions of indigenous peoples, and 7 are country representatives. And then just this past the COP in Madrid at COP25, the parties have welcomed a work plan, 12 activities, and to really bring in local communities, indigenous peoples, and other stakeholders. And we look forward to engage many experts in the room to see that. But so the platform is there, the system is there, the work plan is there. Now it's go to implementation. And so this is a pivotal year, and this is a very opportune time for us to be part of this conversation. So thank you.
That's great. And I think the role of indigenous knowledge is key We saw that in the film with knowing which specific grains are drought resistant, how they're stored, all of that. So that's great to hear that work is being done on that. A bit more on that, perhaps, Louise, you can expand. The Great Green Wall has been around. Sorry, I'm going to reframe the question a bit. The Great Green Wall Initiative was conceived in about 2007, and then in more recent years, there's been a similar initiative around the Silk Road in China, which has been described as the Great Green Wall of China. So these are major initiatives. And what has UNCCD learned from these initiatives about how to successfully link things like local communities, traditional knowledge with, what lessons have you learned from these large-scale initiatives?
Okay. That's a very big question. Okay, what have we learned? I think from the big initiatives, I think we've learned mosaic of land uses. So there's quite a lot of talk about planting trees, right? That the solution is plant trees. And that's true. Trees are good. Trees within a landscape are a good thing. But I think get the balance of land uses right. So that includes urban uses, agricultural uses, protected areas. So get the mixture, and that's the healthiest way of keeping the landscape in balance. So I think that's one thing. In terms of technology and indigenous knowledge, I would say there's probably two things that I've learned. One is that the technology is there, but we shouldn't be patronizing, actually. So we shouldn't assume that people only want to use the technology that they've always used. Sometimes they are very open to a modern version of the traditional way of doing it. They're quite protective, indigenous communities, of their own indigenous created knowledge. And I think the assumption, because an indigenous person created it, that it's therefore fair game for everybody else to take, and there's no intellectual property there, is also something I think that we've learned and heard quite strongly. So I think on technology, right technology in the right place at the right time, taking the traditional knowledge and not being afraid of updating it for the 21st century. And I would say having respect for the local communities, both in terms of their intellectual input and also their rights to pick and jump off the technology that they've created. So, did I answer that question? I'm not sure I did. Did I?
No, that's great. That's a really interesting point about the intellectual property. That's something definitely not often brought up in the discussion. Let's see how much time we have. We don't have too much. Let's see. I'll go to you, Imme. So you have ample ends at both of the spectrum, working in the Amazon as well as at the international level. Could you describe a bit about how you've seen integrated efforts work well?
I think my answer will build on what has been said previously, and I think it's very good that you have this mix of institutional perspectives, both on governance actors as well as on problems to tackle. Yes, what I learned most from working on the Amazon and in the Amazon is that isolated approaches don't work. Yeah, so when I was working in the pilot program of the G7 to protect the Brazilian rainforests, and I was told by one of from the development bank, from the German development bank, this project, he said, is not about people, it's about trees. Yeah, so and that obviously did not work. Yeah, so either focusing only on conservation areas, for example, protecting the forest from human use, or what I think is still was a problem with when the discussion about REDD+ started in the Amazon, focusing only on CO2 emissions as a metric. Yeah, that won't help. So what I have seen, and what I tried also to promote while I was there, with all my visitors I had coming from Germany, was to show there is a diversity of forms of land use in the Amazon, and there are local innovative practices which are not known, because in Brazil, the Amazon is more than half of the territory, but is a peripheral region. It's a bit difficult to think about it like that, but it's not part of the core policy making, for example. And for decades, the local ways of land use and of production, of integrated production systems, have been considered to be primitive and not productive. And so the marginalization was very deep. So I think this, when you look at the years when fire prevention and forest protection worked, it was because it was a differentiated approach which took land use seriously and the right of people to use the land for their livelihood, and tried to combine it with fire, so educating people to prevent outbreak of fires, because burning belongs to the traditional ways of managing the land. So not forbidding it, but saying, how can we control fires, especially when there is a drought, when there is an El Nino. And then to control deforestation of those who do it for speculative land grabbing. And because these are different motives, these are capitalized agents who do that. Then it was an integrated action by a series of ministries: infrastructure, agriculture, environment cooperated there. So integrated policies to use the instruments constructively together. And I think it was very important that the federal government approached local authorities and treated them as partners, and did not superimpose their motivations also to gain reputation and not lose it at international climate negotiations, for example. So I think these factors together helped, but they have to be defended. These approaches have to be defended. And I think that it's really important to be at the ground and to see local partners in their diversity as important parts of programs, and not think that, for example, just use experiences elsewhere as blueprints, which can easily be and productively be repeated. I think that is very important.
Thank you. So it's already 6:30, but if you don't mind, hopefully we have 10 or 15 minutes to take some questions from the audience. Yes.
Microphone or?
Okay. And if you could introduce yourself.
Yeah, thank you. My name is Detlef University of Bonn. Daniel Zweger was so kind to switch on. Okay. Daniel was so kind to leave us with only 2 take-home messages, so we don't have to carry that much. But from a research perspective, I would say there's quite a few additional take-home messages that we need to take into account in order to understand the relationship between drought and famine and what's beyond it. First point I would make here is, in the words of Alex de Waal, that famine there's nothing natural about it, as Patrick put it so nicely in his documentary, but famine is a crime. And famine is used on purpose to punish populations. This began in the 1840s with the British starving more than 1 million people in Ireland, and this kind of crimes are still happening. And I think we shouldn't shy away from that. So Patrick, you should put that very shortly in the end of your film, but I think there's much more to that. The second point I would make is that the problem is not that much famine as an emergency, because that can be managed, as the documentary showed us very nicely. But the problem is complex emergencies. So when famine overlaps with political instability and collapsed territories like Somalia, for example. And the third and last point I would like to make is that we should also take into account that we need to understand more about how to avoid harm. So what the WFP is doing there is very nice, but it does have side effects. And in a case in the area where I work in the Afar region, in Afar regional state in Ethiopia, for example, food aid is sold in the market in order to buy ammunition and arms. So this is something very difficult to control. What do you do about that? What plan do responsible people have to avoid this kind of negative side effects? Thank you.
Thank you for sharing those points. Yes?
Yes. My name is Wim van Immerzeel. I live in Peru. Work in Peru and Tanzania. I found what Imme said about the Amazon very striking. So people are burning the Amazon forest, and then you would get, how did you call it? You called it something. It is something. It is an ecological collapse. You would get savannahization. Is that how you say it? So an area which is not yet totally lost to degradation will degrade. Its hydrological cycle will degrade. Then you could expect that all the soy that is being grown could become subject to droughts. And our chicken in the Netherlands and our pigs will have no food. They will suffer a little bit, and we will suffer maybe more. But I wonder if drought and famine are also to be understood in ecological terms. And I think that there is an opening there. When I saw these pictures in Patrick's movie, I thought, oh, all these areas are extremely degraded. Yeah, okay.
Thank you very much. I'm Eva Veltzin, formerly with ICRISAT in Mali. My question is really to all of you about, there was a lot of lessons around learning and innovation. And as in my experience, many of the countries that are facing drought and famine regularly have very weak innovation systems. So what are your experiences or recommendations to strengthen innovative capacity in many of those countries, especially in the Sahel, that were not mentioned in the discussions here?
Okay, let me continue with the last.
Okay. Would anyone like to answer?
I think the point of innovation is really an important one. What we try to do is build capacity of the local and regional governments to understand the problem, understand their role, and help them take responsibility for that. And the innovation part would come from, for example, helping them to develop an integrated urban water management plan where they think about these plans. Maybe if there's a city, pull in your informal settlement as well, because the settlement also needs services. People there need food, people there need water, health and sanitation needs to work. And I think the role of local governments is to provide basic services. Now, if you bring the overlay of a threat like an extreme, and I think when we talk about drought, we also need to talk about floods, because you could see both extremes happening immediately one after the other, and we've seen that happen as well. So the preparedness about it, making sure that we break through the silos, as I mentioned before, I think that is actually still innovative. We see it as something that should just happen. It's for us standard practice, but it's not being applied at the moment. And I just think very basic, simple things that a local government could do is make sure that the water pipes are tight and watertight and not wasting water, not wasting resources. Making sure that your sanitation system would function even in time of drought. Raising awareness of particular community groups, thinking about children who also can carry the message further to their families and so on. But also looking at imposing fines for people who abuse water usage in time of drought and so on. So there's a whole range of things which maybe for a northern country might be standard practice, but we do need to instill that and get people to understand what they could do, and that their particular action could have a ripple effect towards others as well.
So just quickly on maybe each of them, just quickly on the unintended consequences of food aid. I think that's a very legitimate question. The WFP is moving increasingly towards purchasing food on the local market where it's available, and also, interestingly, doing more kind of food for work programs and food for cash programs that are trying to look at land rehabilitation. I think for UNCCD, it's very much about the health and productivity of the land being a buffer that builds drought resilience, builds flood resilience. If the land is healthy, then you have a better chance of getting through an El Nino or a flood season. So I think it's moving in that direction. I think we are seeing one of the consequences, though, particularly of drought and also of degradation, in terms of the conflict and migration discussion. So there is the kind of increasing conflict and increasing migration when the productivity of the land falls or when drought hits. It's, you know, I'm a migrant, I'm here, and because I have my small village in England can't provide me with the opportunities that I'd be looking for. So there's nothing wrong with migration per se, but we're taking away the choices of a lot of people in terms of migration. Much of the work, I think, that needs to or can happen in the future is to try to stabilize areas where people are being forced to leave, where because of drought, because of climate change, because of degradation, they don't have many options. Places like the Sahel, it's a particularly raw issue for them, and I think they're moving increasingly in the direction of trying to stabilize as many areas as they can, get the ecosystems as healthy as they can, so they can survive as long as possible in those regions.
Definitely. Yes, go ahead.
Just thank you for the questions. Just to address how innovation in least developed countries can happen and what are we doing. So a couple of things. One, there's a work stream or there's a constituted body within the UNFCCC called the Warsaw International Mechanism. And so how that is addressing the needs of least developed country is looking at a comprehensive risk management, looking at assessment to address reducing the risk, to transfer the risk, to retain the risk. So what does it really mean specifically? Just to give you an example, it's using the emerging technologies like artificial intelligence, and they've developed a platform called the Fiji Platform Risk Transfer. So it's a platform where people can pose questions, where knowledge seekers can pose questions. If it's a drought question, if it's a famine-related question, if it's a water resource-related question, and then what the platform does is it's tap into the expertise of the whole world, where expertise can actually address the answers, provide the answer. So that's one. The other one, there's also the process, for example, the National Adaptation Planning process. What it does is it works with the government to develop adaptation plans to address, to foster some of the innovations that are needed to address these emerging challenges.
Toolbox.
So that this
Can we steal them in our drought toolbox?
So that you can talk to them, yeah. Have this.
Great. Sounds like you have something to talk about at the reception. So thank you for your questions and for the great answers. There's a statement made at the end of the film that perhaps Michael can expand on in his closing remarks that I thought was really powerful. Famines happen because we allow them to happen, and I think the same can definitely be said about droughts. As we've heard here tonight, there are many ways that we can help prevent their effects, and we can help increase the resilience of local communities. So Michael, perhaps you want to end on a few words.
I hope you have learned a little bit about what drought is, that drought is much more than a deficiency of water, that drought is linked to technologies, to policies to also to political economy very much. The last message that maybe is something which also Daniel always says, drought, if well perceived and well taken up by policy, can be a connector between a lot of different policy areas. And that is a very interesting thing. It goes much beyond natural resource management. It is about saving credit, political economy, and so on. So drought, if the countries take up it seriously and create a multi-level dialogue between the different actors and the different sectors, can really be a connector and an interesting way to create coherence. And maybe that starts with drought only, but I'm convinced that once the actors are connected, they are connected in many other areas too. So we can also see drought as a kind of option and entry point for policy coherence, multi-level, sectoral, and even to the international level that we have heard. That's my last point. And now I invite you for a little bit of discussion and continuing look at the pictures and enjoy the evening. Thank you.